Good afternoon. So if you guys, I'd like to invite you, if you're in the very, very back, please feel free to move up a little bit as well. We're going to exercise some initiative since we don't have anybody telling us to start. We'll go ahead and get started. We're really excited to be doing this so close to lunch. It's the prime window to get to do a panel. My name is Derek Schuler, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to the Rise of Classical Education. We're really excited about the opportunity to present our panel today. What I'm going to do, while we go through, if you guys have any questions you'd like us to talk about, anything you hear along the way, please feel free to take a note card. I'm going to put some on the front tables. Put any questions together and send them up to us. We'll also do a question and answer down toward the end as well. Right. First of all, I'd like to thank, actually this panel was proposed by somebody who's not here, Brandon Steinhauser, who's out of Texas. She's a big advocate for school choice and education, a big advocate of classical education as well. Unfortunately, her husband is in the Texas National Guard, has drill this weekend, and she has to stay home and watch the kids. So she asked us if we'd be willing to go from, keep this together, and we're really excited the panel we have today. I think what we've seen over the past several years, especially in the realm of education, is a lot of parents have been seeing what's been happening in education. So there's really a keen awakening the past several years on what is going on, primarily in public schools, but we're also seeing a lot of policy that's expanding school choice options here, and we're really excited to talk about some of those. I think a lot of that, when I talk about what's going on in public education, it's not just some controversial social topics, but years ago, there was a decision to really take out moral and civic education in schools. And I think the classical movement is also a movement toward putting that back into schools. And the great thing about the education realm itself, there are a lot of great models and opportunities for families. You'll hear from, we'll have discussions from homeschool, private Christian, private secular, and I work in the public charter school space myself. So with that, just a quick introduction, introduce our panelists, and then we'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Derek Schuler. I'm the CEO of Ascent Classical Academies. We're a network of tuition-free charter schools that started in Colorado. My connection to classical education was actually fairly unintentional. I'm one of the really dangerous ones as a parent looking for better options for my kids, and didn't know how to start a school. We ended up partnering with Hillsdale College in their early years, doing work to support parents like us learn how to put together a school that's publicly funded. My background was in technology, national security. I was an officer in the United States Army Reserves. After founding Golden View Classical Academy in 2015, we decided that this work in classical education is really important, and we're going to do more of it. So, and just finally, right now, we're continuing to grow our work with tuition-free classical schools, and we're expanding here in North and South Carolina, where I'm originally from. So excited about that. I'd also like to introduce Leigh Bortins on the end over here. Leigh has a phenomenal background as well. I'm going to read her bio instead of trying to pick and choose. So Leigh's a nationally acclaimed educator, known for her ability to demystify the fundamental tools of learning. She's a teacher, author, and commentator, and credited with launching the home-centered learning education movement. Leigh also came to this from a very different background, with a degree in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan, where she worked in the aerospace industry before becoming an educator. She has a doctorate of divinity from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Hamilton. She's been teaching for 30 years, both children and adults. She's written several books, including The Core, The Question, The Conversations, which explore the classical trivium from a parent's perspective. She's also authored complete K-12 curriculum guides for parents and homeschool tutors all across the country. And I'll just touch on that she's the founder and chief visionary officer for Classical Conversations, which is an organization supporting homeschool learning throughout the country. And I've encountered a lot of students who've been doing classical conversations, and it's just a tremendous program. She and her husband and children and grandchildren all live in Pinehurst, right down the road. Then I'd like to introduce Sam Cox. Sam here has been an educator for about 35 years. He served in 8 different K-12 private schools as a history teacher in the humanities department. He's been a cross-country and track coach, dean of students, upper school head, and since 2001, he's been the head of 3 different classical Christian schools, primarily in the southeast of Virginia and North Carolina. He's currently the interim head of school at Haw River Christian Academy in Pittsburgh, and has worked supporting leadership development and coaching through the Society of Classical Learning. He and his wife live in Greensboro, and he is also a veteran, an Army veteran as well. So, and then finally, but not least, Josh Herring. Josh is a graduate of Hillsdale College, where he received his undergraduate degree in history. He's currently in the PhD program at Faulkner University. I understand there's a whole table of you guys in the back. Thanks for sticking around. And Josh is currently with Thales Academies, where he's the Director of Classical Education. So he asked me to also plug that he does have a podcast, The Optimist Curmudgeon. And I've listened to a couple of episodes and encourage you to check that out. So, great. With that, what I'll do is like to turn over, and we'll start with Leigh at the end, and just if you could describe what is your model of classical education. Just take a couple minutes, tell us about what you're doing that you see to be different in the education space. I'll hand the mic over.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm glad that I was able to do this. So at Classical Conversations, we are a K-12 support organization for homeschooling parents. That's what I say to people that are like bankers and lawyers and insurance folks. But what we actually do is we help anybody that's interested in understanding Christian classical education. So we have actually curriculum for preschool through the PhD level. We just are graduating in May, our first 7 students with degrees in classical education, masters, who will be prepared to teach at some of the schools you guys may be representing, with 100 more in the pipeline. And it took us 6 years to fight the accreditation organizations in order to make that a possibility, because when they heard classical studies, they thought Greek and Hebrew. They didn't know that there was such a thing as classical arts. And so that is our emphasis. That's one of the things that makes us different. We believe classical education is not about Latin, literature, logic, and the classical studies, or classical literature. We believe it's about grammar, dialectic rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, harmonics, and astronomy. And that there's an art to education that is accessible to anybody. Our motto is to know God and to make Him known. We do not believe that classical can be separated from Christian. They are one and the same. And so we try to help parents see that if that's true, that means anybody with children is equipped to homeschool, because the Lord, if you seek Him, will help you to do what you need to do to educate your children. So we have started in '97 with 11 students in my basement. We are not a drop-off program. The parents participate. In fact, they are our customers. We don't usurp the responsibility of any parent. It's their job to educate their children, not ours. We meet 1 day a week in order to practice with our children the classical pedagogy as well as Christian. And then we have 3,000 of these communities around the United States, which is 120,000 plus students in America, as well as we're in 50 other countries. If you put all 120,000 children together into a consolidated school district, we would be the 20th largest school district in the United States. Homeschooling mothers rock. They rule the world literally, and it's been really just a great privilege as we see this rise of classical education. It's coming from leaders who are going, how come these homeschooling moms can teach physics and I can't get our mothers to show up to a PTA meeting? What we do is very different.
Sam Cox, and I'm representing classical Christian, I guess more traditional schools within the bricks and mortar schools. And there are over 600 schools that self-describe nationally as classical Christian schools. Perhaps more than that, depends on how you count them. And so I've worked with a number of them, and you know, they all vary a little bit, of course. Some of them are denominational, affiliated with the ministry of the church. Most of them are independent and interdenominational. The schools that I've led have been in that venue of being independent and interdenominational. And we believe as well that the classical liberal arts fits in very nicely with the Christian paradigm and a biblical worldview, and that the study of the classical liberal arts, it's very difficult to separate from the Christian faith. And so our schools really integrate a Christ-centered biblical curriculum with the classical liberal arts and sciences. And so this movement is growing both in the homeschool and in the classical charter schools, and certainly in the classical Christian schools. We'll talk a little bit, maybe more specifically about that growth here in a minute. But you know, we really feel like that many educators outside the classical Christian realm are looking at measuring the product of their students through what they know and what they can do. And those are important questions. We ask those questions as well. But we think the more important question is what ought they do, and really who have they become. Because I feel like, and I think within classical Christian education circles, that all education, whether it is secular, faith-based, progressive, public, or classical, is about the soul. And you know, what is being poured into the soul is a reflection of what's coming out of the soul. And we feel very strongly that education is about the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, and that wisdom and virtue can be nourished through the classical liberal arts and sciences in a Christ-centered sort of way.
All right, this is exciting. I think I'm going to be a bit of a counterpoint to what John just laid out. That's fine. So my name is Josh Herring. I'm here on behalf of Leigh Academy. I serve as their Dean of Classical Education, and I want to at least make a pitch for a slightly different version of classical education. Leigh Academy began in 2007. We were founded out of the recognition of a clear market need. Our school was founded by a Catholic entrepreneur named Bob Letty. He owns his company, Captive Air, is the largest kitchen ventilation equipment company in the world. And Leigh Academy is Bob's way of answering a decaying culture. He believes that the West is in decline, and the only real way to change that decline is through education. So that's really where Leigh Academy comes in. We were kind of formed, we're a bit of an entrepreneurial project that has kind of figured itself out over the years. We started with a bunch of parents who wanted better options for their kids in our local public education system. And so our initial program was built through kindergarten to 5th grade using a model called direct instruction. Then we get to 6th grade, we then begin what we call the classical curriculum approach, where we're moving away from scripted lessons and into much more direct teaching. We have a Socratic pedagogy that we emphasize across all of our classes. Our classes are aiming to do multiple Socratic seminars per quarter. We have, at this point, we have 14 campuses. We have 10 of those are in North Carolina. We're also in Virginia and Tennessee, and if all goes according to plan, next summer we will be expanding into South Carolina as well. So we're up to about 6,000 students, and this year we officially, we've had a soft launch happening over the last couple of years, where we officially started with our Leigh College students, who are not dual enrolled, but fully Leigh College students. That started this year. We also have finished the process of beginning an in-house publishing firm called Leigh Press. On all of your tables, you'll see different flyers with where you can find more information about that. But we are attempting to make the argument that classical education should be accessible to literally every student. that every student in the United States should have access to the best of what has been taught and thought. And that's what we take classical education to be. We are looking at, our literature courses are set up around various lists of great books that are arranged chronologically to align with a primary source-driven history curriculum. We put students through a rigorous trivium set of courses wherein 6th and 7th grade they take formal grammar, in 8th and 10th grade they do formal logic, 9th grade is a research and writing class, 11th grade is a philosophy survey, and then that culminates in senior thesis. They take pretty standard science and math courses. We require all of our middle school students to take Latin. In high school, we let them have a choice between Latin or Spanish. Our goal is to literally build a scalable classical model that can be operated in such a way that it is affordable to the average family. So our tuition point, we just raised it to $6,200 a year for K-12. That's the first time in 14 years that we've had to raise tuition. We had to deal with inflation as well as a network. So we are expanding. We continue, our campuses are regularly waitlisted. We have a lot going on as a school network, and it's an exciting place to be. So we would root the idea of classical education in looking at what is it that helps us understand what it means to be human. And certainly Christianity is a large part of that, but we would say that is inside of the broader classical conversation. We look at both Athens and Jerusalem as crucial to that, and so Athens has a lot of stuff that predates Christianity, and that is still quite relevant to the question of classical education.
Great. Again, my journey into this, so I represent the public charter sector of classical education. Specifically, we consider what we'd be doing with the St. Classical Academies to be an American classical education, really focused on the ideas, the best ideas of the West, coming back from the Greeks to the Romans, to your point about Athens and Jerusalem, and pulling those threads forward into the American experiment today, and how those ideas out of antiquity influenced the founders of America to get us where we are today. So, and I think that's important to make that distinction, because there are other charter networks like Great Hearts out of Arizona and Texas that kind of flip that. At least in the high school sequence, they start with America and move into the antiquities, while we go the other way around, about building that foundation on Greek philosophical thinking and bringing it forward. Funny, before we decided to start building more schools after establishing Golden View, with the intent that I personally needed a school for my kids. It was one and done, but we just saw such a need and opportunity to build more classical schools. I think there's an urgency about what we're doing. To Mr. Herring's point, that we see the West and America, if we don't raise our children to what does it mean to be civically minded and a responsible citizen, we're going to lose our country. And I think we have an urgency around that, and the need to expand, develop citizens who appreciate reason. We at least from my point, the idea that if you look at a lot of mission statements of public schools today, you'll hear a lot about college and career readiness. Those are great things. We all want our kids to be successful at all of that, but really, we want them to flourish in life. We want them to want to pursue excellence. The idea of pursuing wisdom and virtue is what we aspire to have out of a good classical education as well. Right now we're getting ready to open our 5th campus, and we have several getting ready to start here. But my point earlier, before we decided to do more schools, I had a conversation with Mr. Luddy about what you guys are doing with ALEs, and I think he just provided a wealth of experience and his vision of why this is important work. And let's all get together on the same team and help support our children. So kind of on that note, I would like to go back and touch a little more of what is classical education. We talk about what is classical education. What do we mean, and how is it different than what's going on in a lot of schools today? And I'll just say at least from my perspective, and I think Leigh, you touched on a lot of the elements of liberal arts being very important to that. I think I'd like to kind of send it around to the end of the table, people who've been around this a lot longer, to get your take. But for me, it's really the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. It's developing the mind, hearts, and bodies of our young people to be good citizens. Again, there are a lot of elements. I think if you ask 1,000 people in classical education, what is classical education? You'll get about 1,000 different answers. So I'll hand it back and love to have you guys give your perspectives.
Okay, I've got 4 minutes. It's a lot of time. Okay, so
Use it all.
I'm gonna use it all. Okay, just do this. I'm done because I can go on. So for us, there's a lot of ways I can explain what classical education is. So I'm going to give you some analogies. The first is that classical education teaches your children how to tell jokes. I'm going to tell you a joke. What do John the Baptist and Winnie the Pooh have in common? Now, a lot of people will answer honey. The thing is, I said it was a joke, and honey's not funny, right? So we have to have the same language in order to tell jokes, because usually they're a pun, a twist on words. So let me do it again. What do John the Baptist and Winnie the Pooh have in common? The same middle name. Right. How is that classical? I used some words. You used your senses to take them in. That's grammar. Then what happened? You thought about things. And I could see by your eyes you were thinking. And then I gave you the answer, and you thought some more. So that's being dialectic. And then what did you do that was rhetorical, that made me as a mother know my child understood something? You laughed. Classical education is inherently human. And as the author of human beings, it makes it inherently Christian, because Christ is the beginning and end of all that we do. Right? Let me give you a more academic kind of analogy. Because Christians should be the happiest, most cheerful people on the face of the earth. We have so much joy, right? Because we have hope. And when we talk about teaching wisdom and virtue, of course, as a Christian, my first question is, whose wisdom and virtue do you want my children to learn? So we need to define our terms as a classicalist. So another reason why classical education is approachable to everybody is I have a thesis that the only way you've ever learned anything, if you actually learned something, was through the classical arts. Every human being has the exact same 3 things, just at different levels. We all have some sort of sensory system that we use to input information, to observe, to attend, to analyze. We all have some sort of nervous system, a brain, that we use to think with. And then we all have a body, a way to take those words and ideas that we've been thinking about and have questions on and do something with it. Whether it's a presentation or build a car or give a speech or tell a joke or whatever it is, knitting, welding. This is what the classical arts are, and this is what makes classical education inherently human. But let's look at the scriptural background for classical education, because the Bible was written as though some sort of classical pedagogist wrote it. The Old Testament is full of what? Grammar, stories, lists, laws, things that you memorize. In fact, the scriptures say in the Old Testament to hide God's word in your heart. Then Jesus came to earth and said, you know all that stuff you learned? It's me. I'm the fulfillment of it. And how did he explain that to people? He asked them questions, or he told them stories that made them ask questions. In fact, we know he was so good at questions, the Pharisees in the temple said they'd never met a 12-year-old who could ask such great questions. That's what we're trying to do in the dialectic. And then, of course, Jesus died, rose again, and left the Holy Spirit with us. And the epistles were written, and they're God-breathed. And they teach us, how should we now live? The entire Bible was written with grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric in mind, because that's how we were designed. So in classical conversations, we say that we want to help parents teach their children to name like Adam, ask questions like Jesus, and persuade like Paul. And this is why we believe anybody can teach using the classical arts.
What she said. Yeah, I agree with that. I think we have a very similar approach in the bricks and mortar classical Christian schools as the classical conversations homeschool movement does. I define classical Christian education, kind of the threefold, the trinity, so to speak, as content, approach, and disposition. The content is the canon of Western literature, developing that Western Christian idea, and reading the great books and engaging in the great conversation, just to focus on the classical liberal arts and sciences, and going back in the pre-Christian era, in the Greco-Roman world, and borrowing from those. And so the richness of the curriculum in terms of what is being taught, that content, reading primary sources rather than relying on textbooks and that prescriptive type of textbook, type of curriculum. And rather than teaching to a test, but really that rich content. And then the second piece of that, the approach or the method, is that trivium, the grammar, the dialectic, and rhetoric, really more of the pedagogy of how that content is taught. And then the third part of that is the disposition, and that's the classroom teacher. We're told in Scripture that we are to be like our teacher, of course, the teacher with the capital T, Jesus Christ. And Christ we would say, was the first classical Christian teacher, an initial class of 12. And of course, only 11 passed his class. But he was teaching in the framework of the Greco-Roman world and Hebrew world. And teaching with narrative, with stories, with parables, of the Socratic method of asking questions. And so that disposition, we really want our teachers to model Christ. However imperfectly they do model, obviously, but to still model and reflect as image bearers, and the wrestling with ideas and the asking of essential questions, and how they're communicating the content of the classical Christian pedagogy, but to do it with humility, and to do it with grace, and to do it with great wisdom, so that these students can be on their own path of pursuing wisdom and virtue.
I think you're right that if we ask a bunch of people how to find classical education, we get a bunch of different answers. I would start that with what I think we're going for as a school is trying to help every student know what it means to live a life of freedom and to live that well. That's a long path. It takes a long time to get there. There's some of that that's academic, there's some of that that is habitual, and we're trying to help students figure out what virtue is, both simultaneously cognitively through the courses that they study, but also through the ways that we ask them to live. So for us, that last part takes at least two forms. We get a lot of mileage out of our dress code as forming certain habits within students. We also have a series of virtues, we call it the Leigh outcomes, that we try to work into every lesson that we teach. And I will freely grant that we have less access inside a secular classical model than the Christian side does to explain why those virtues matter. But we try to avoid that conversation if we can. We don't really want to get bogged down into potentially relativistic students talking about why they should be honest. We assert that they should be honest, and that's a habit that we are going to try to the best of our ability to ingrain in them. But at the same time, there's a lot of nuts and bolts to how we get there. I have a love-hate relationship with Dorothy Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning essay. But I don't think that does a great job of laying out a specific grammar school, logic school, rhetoric school approach. But I think all three of those methods are always happening in a good classroom. You're always learning particular material that you need to remember later. You're always interrogating that material, and you are preparing to be able to speak about that material. We try to work that into really every level across all of our classes. We don't wait until they're seniors to ask students to prepare a presentation or stand and give a speech. We're always kind of working that into our pedagogy. We like Mortimer Adler a lot at Thales. We think a lot of what he did with Paideia and developing Socratic conversation and the idea of a teacher as sometimes you are lecturing, sometimes you are coaching, sometimes you are guiding practice. And part of the craft of teaching is figuring out what is the appropriate pedagogy to help this student learn this material at this stage of learning. I think there's a lot of value in thinking about the alignment between the classical education and the liberal arts tradition. In a lot of ways, the 7 medieval liberal arts are different studies of order. They map really easily onto contemporary subjects. Some of them are direct. I mean, obviously there is no history in the trivium or quadrivium, but we still teach history. We're still learning these things because they're worth knowing, and we want all of our students to know them. I think there's a lot of truth in Matthew Arnold's line about education is studying the best of what has been taught and thought. So we're always looking for what has been time-tested, what is proven. We're not looking to quickly jump to the latest gadget or the latest pedagogy. If something works, we want to find out. Why does it work, and would that work in our context? We look to Socrates as a core model for what we're trying to do. There are a lot of questions that Socrates poses and very few that he answers. There are a lot of questions we want our students to think about, and as a school, we work pretty hard to limit ourselves in what kind of conclusions we draw. I don't necessarily want to tell my students what I think the good life is, but I want them to ask that question, and I want to have trained in them the deep habits of seeking truth so that they actually consider what is and is not a good life. And I have to trust that Aristotle is right, and we actually do have reason, and that reason matters. And if we've trained them in logic well enough, that they will spot really fallacious answers to that kind of question. So really, to make a longish answer a little shorter, I think classical education is training students in the habits of living well. We do that through constant conversation, through constant study, and through living together in community inside the school.
Great, thanks you all. And I would say, just from our perspective, I think we definitely use a lot of, it sounds like, a lot of the same things that Thales looks to. Leigh, you mentioned teaching virtues, whose virtues. From our, in our schools, we use Aristotelian virtues pretty much right out of ethics. So I'm not sure where you guys have yours. Again, we can have the conversation about where does truth come from. When we look back to the classical position on virtue, really we look at the mean of extremes, and that's our approach to Aristotelian or classical virtue education. And in our environment, I talked a little bit about forming the mind, the hearts and bodies of our young people. And I think, again, when public education decided to no longer consider the moral and civic virtue development of kids, they did take a position on moral and civic virtue. It's just unintentional and it's scattered, is what that means. There's no focus, there's no leading toward what is good. We do a senior thesis in our schools with the topic of what is the good life. So again, that's the culmination of, again, being intentional about integrating virtue into our academic program. So when our kindergarten kids are learning about George Washington going across the frozen Delaware River to kill Hessian soldiers on Christmas, they're talking about courage. How did this hero exhibit courage? We do the same thing when we study scientists and this idea of wonder. So again, we are very intentional about the formation of the heart and weaving the virtue conversation throughout all of our normal subjects as well. We do content, we do direct instruction in the younger grades, and as kids get larger, bigger, older. We do PE, so hopefully we're moderating some of that. But we do move into more Socratic learning. We are also heavy on source materials. And instead of reading textbooks or interpretations of snippets of a document, again, we also go through and read the Missouri Compromise or the Northwest Ordinance and have the conversations of what do these things mean. I think what's missing in a lot of schools as well is, especially for little kids, is the development of the moral imagination. they're not reading good stories, they're not being exposed to heroes and villains, and really igniting their love of learning. So I think that's something as a parent of a now a 5th and 6th grader who's started in our schools, something that I'm excited to see being a part of their formation and development. Kind of leading into the next question, and I'll send it back this way. What kind of parent is typically coming into your schools? What are they looking for? What are their expectations when they're engaging your program or coming into your school?
That's a great question. It's what we struggle with sometimes, because I think certainly as administrators and teachers, we want to think that we have parents who have heard the vision that we articulate. And I think we do a pretty good job of articulating a vision of classical education, formative content, virtue-driven education. Honestly, the vast majority of our parents are coming to us because they want something better than public education. And they don't have, most of our parents are not themselves formed by a classical or liberal arts education. They have, a lot of them were either poorly served by public education and want something better for their kids, or they went to an excellent public school and are really dissatisfied with the poor quality of public schools. They know that it can be done really well, and wherever they were is not great. We also have plenty of parents who they would gladly be at a very expensive private school, but we are the less expensive private school. So they think what we do is good, and they're kind of indifferent to our virtue and our mission stuff, but they really like the price tag. So we tend to get a lot of those. We also get plenty of folks at our school who would love to go to a private school that costs $30,000 a year, but could never do that for their family. And so they're really excited that our price point is something that's approachable. That tends to be the kind of parent that comes to us. We see that really as an opportunity, as we get to not only bring students into this great conversation that transcends the ages that maybe for whatever reason they don't know anything about, we also get to help bring parents into that. I've had plenty of conversations over the years with parents who tell me, oh, you know what, I never really somehow managed to not learn about Christopher Columbus, but this week I've been learning a lot about Christopher Columbus because I'm helping my daughter get ready for the quiz. And it's a sort of, it works to also kind of bring parents into this as well. So that's Thales.
I think we have a variety of different types of parent expectations and reasons why they come. It really varies by the classical Christian school, and I think it varies within the school and in part in the life cycle of the school. You know, this movement of classical Christian education, that is centuries old, but in the West began to abandon that in the 19th century. The abandonment did not start with COVID, and the last 4 or 5 years or whatever with the social issues. The abandonment started in the middle of the 19th century. But the Renaissance, this resurrection of classical education and classical Christian education started really in the 80s and the 90s. Our schools are all relatively new. And when a school is started, you have the risk takers that are dissatisfied with public education. Some of them dissatisfied with private education, secular private education that is academically rigorous and college preparatory, but it's really about developing a product in many cases. And so some disillusioned parents coming from there. And so these are the founding fathers and mothers of these young Christian classical schools. And so most of them are, these early days, are fervent in their Christian faith, and they either have read a lot about classical Christian education or they're intrigued by it and they want something different. But what I've seen is that as schools mature and age, and after 10 years, 20 years, and the first and second generation of parents have left, and instead of renting from the basement of the Baptist church, you have a beautiful building with bells and whistles and whiteboards, you're accredited, and even though we're not about test scores and college acceptance, the product is awfully good. Statistically, the test scores are better at classical Christian schools than any other type of school. And the college acceptances are quite acceptable, excellent. But that's not the end game. It's more about human flourishing. But as schools grow and mature, you have a wider network of parents that, maybe they're seeking a safe haven, physically safe, morally, socially, or whatever, leaving the perils of public education as they see it. They want, a good, quote, conservative school. They see the college acceptances, they see the test scores, and so you tend to have, I guess, a greater variety of parents that are seeking out these schools. Not all of them are really seeking out a classical school, and not all of them are really seeking out a Christian school. They want a school that is preparing students with excellence, and they want a school that is removed from a lot of progressive ideology, and so it becomes a mixed bag, and there's the challenge and the tension of maintaining, staying true to your mission and your vision, and not just trying to capitulate to 20 different types of parental demands.
Sam, okay. And can you speak to how do you deal with those parents who come into your classical school wanting something different? How do you get them on board with your school being classical and what that means?
I think parent education is perhaps as important as student education. And I've done it, and my team has done it in a variety of ways, often unsuccessfully. I used to write a lot, and I would write wonderful and glorious blogs that were quite lengthy, and initially 20 and 25 years ago, maybe 30, 40, 50% of our parents would read them. But as time went on, the demographics of parents changed, and we have our smartphones. I recall a parent, and she was not a young parent, she was an older parent, who said, Sam, I used to really read all the things you wrote, but now if I can't read it on my phone at a red light, it's not being read. And so I had to kind of change what I wrote. But I do think parent education through writing, we do things like lunch and learns, breakfast, coffees, and not just as the head of school, but to have different faculty and staff, and maybe different parents would speak. And we have required readings for parents. We have recommended readings for parents. Some schools, in required reading, there's some accountability. We've never really had that accountability. It's the honor system. But yeah, you got to bring the parents along, and that parent education is crucial. Again, we've had some success and some failures with that.
The only thing I'd add to that is that for us, it's been really important to have already defined our school policies and our school curriculum before those parents come in. Because often parents will come in, and sometimes they have good ideas, sometimes they have terrible ideas, and they are almost never interested in a discussion. I don't think I've ever had a parent conversation of that nature where the parent wants to hear what I, as someone with a decade of experience in the classroom, think about the merit of their idea. They want to hear, oh, that's great, I'm going to implement that tomorrow. They're not thinking of how a school is a giant piece of interlocking puzzle pieces that are a giant puzzle, and as soon as you change one piece, it affects all the rest. So it matters a lot that sort of the school before that meeting is just well defined. I think there's a lot of value in schools thinking through very clearly, we teach this because, we have this policy because, and if there is some period of review, that may be every summer the handbooks get reviewed, or every 3 years the curriculum goes under review. But these things can't be changed lightly or quickly. It's incredibly hard on teachers. It's also really hard on students when things change very quickly. So I think for the health of a good school, it can't pivot quickly just on an upset parent's demands.
This is fun being last. Okay, so everything they've said about the curriculum that they teach, the original source documents they read, the virtues, all those kind of things, we do in classical conversations too. But our curriculum is not our major focus. I think parents join us for a variety of reasons. One, we know from surveys, they join us because they want the community, they want the help, they want to be with other adults who are also going to homeschool. And we know that they stay for the accountability when they start to realize, oh, I can still homeschool and have delight-directed education during most of my child's life. Our family can travel when we want, we can start businesses when we want, we can start sports leagues and join them whenever we want, but I still need someone to make sure we get our Latin assignment done. We still need someone to help us get the physics, the chemistry labs put together. Right? So they stay for the accountability once they're in, and then they end up leading because of the pedagogy. They meet Christ everywhere and everything that we do. That is our goal, and I know we've come short and we fail, but we have a 70% retention rate in a culture where 30% of children move every single year because the parents are so loyal and committed, because we don't have the problem that you guys have to address where parent education is, you said, it's maybe more important than the students. We think it's the only education that's important, is the parents. And so parents join us who are like-minded in that way. But one thing I want to point out is that, to me, it's a miracle that anybody ever joined us. So think about this. I've been homeschooling 40 years, so that was odd to homeschool. And then almost 30 years ago, we started classical conversations. And I was asking these families to do 3 things. Could we please educate together classically, Christianly, and in a community? And these are homeschoolers. What does that mean? They didn't even know what those words were 30 years ago. And so parent education's been what we had to do in order to have anybody enroll in classical conversations. And this is why I feel like it's a miracle every time a parent joins us, because mostly they join us having no idea why they're joining us. They've just heard something, they've got a friend in the program, they see the results of classical education with grown children, because of all the marketing that's now being done, they're curious. And of course, all of us are here because when a demon is driven out, if there's not something to replace it, 7 more come. And they want to know what is that good thing that can be there to replace it. So I just praise God for a day's worth of effort on a parent trying to understand how to reach their children for Christ.
Yeah, and again, as the person in the charter school world, we have a unique requirement that we have to admit kids by lottery. So we have to send whoever's interested in coming to our school, we have to make opportunities available to them through lottery. I think the parent education piece is extremely important to that. I know during the COVID times when all the schools were shut down, all of our schools stayed open the whole time. So we had a huge influx of parents coming into our schools because we were open. They had no idea what classical education was. A lot of them heard that we're the conservative school, go there. And so they came to us because they care about their kids, but not necessarily for the reasons that we would want them to be there. We've been working hard since schools are back open, and we've lost some. This is the idea that their kids have to work hard and that they have to support them. Some parents aren't in a mindset where that's what they're signing up to do, unfortunately. But we have been fortunate to take it as an opportunity to educate and really bring some of the adults into what classical education is and the great conversation. I know for myself, this wasn't an education I had growing up. I had a good education, but it wasn't of this type. We didn't do great books. So after starting our first school, I actually had the chance to go back and start reading the books that my young children are reading now, which has been a great experience. But again, I do think in addition to touching the lives of our children, this has also given us a great opportunity to have a proximate impact on touching the lives of the adults in our community as well. With that, and on that note, kind of a related question. I know this is somebody's favorite question here on the panel, but how do parents who weren't classically educated themselves support or provide a classical education. And Leigh, I'm going to send this down to you to start on that one.
You know, when a parent says to me, but I can't do this, whatever the this is, I say, that's right, because you wouldn't need the Holy Spirit. Of course you can't do it. You need the body of Christ. You need a team around you. You need your spouse, you need your children, you need your pastor, your priest, whoever it is. So the thing is, we look to the actual institution of school as though that is the only source of education. And it's actually probably the worst form of education. The best form of education is someone who's autodidactic and goes and finds all their own teachers and is curious and interested in everything that they do. But our culture doesn't particularly support that. So, what was the question? I got off track.
How do you help parents who
Who don't-
want to classically educate themselves either support their children into classical school or decide in your case to embark on homeschooling in classical?
Yeah. So we don't feel like they need to know what they're doing. We also know that they were educated in a system that was designed to help them not to know what they're doing. So our expectation is from the beginning that actually none of us know what we're doing. And so we all need to work together with each other. That's it. And so the only answer is prayer and patience.
Yes, very few of our parents, of course, were educated classically. You know, in my 25 years, I can count on one hand. And a little more recently, some of our younger parents are now they graduated from classical schools, are sending their kids, so that the number is increasing. But so many of them see what they missed, and then now what this current generation is missing even more of. Now, I was publicly educated in the 60s and 70s, and it was certainly not a Christian education, and it was not a classical education, but it had some elements. I mean, we read a lot of great books. It was not as politically charged as today's progressive education. And so a lot of parents realized, okay, education has changed. So I was not educated classically, but they're certainly not being educated classically, and certainly not being educated from a Christian standpoint today. And so they desire this for their kids, even if they don't know how to articulate what this is and what they're missing, but they see the difference. And a lot of times it's our kids that are the selling points, our kids and our graduates. You know, they see our rhetoric school students that are working part-time jobs, or they see them at a restaurant, or they see them, you know, that have graduated and they're out in the community and they're working for these parents, and they see a difference. They see a difference in just the quality of their life and the joy that emanates and the way they think, the way that they can think critically, and the way that they can communicate and interact with others, the respect that they show. And sometimes they can't even articulate what they see, but they see the classical school students and the classical school graduates are so very different, and they say, we want this for our kids. And so, again, while they can't always articulate what it is and why, they do know that they see a difference.
Part of our model, we stress a lot the idea of customer service. When we think about every parent as someone who is choosing to be at our school. I remember years ago, our CFO made a presentation to the faculty and said, just keep in mind that you are competing with free. Like, we have to convince parents that it is better that they come here and be with us than that they go to the local public school they can enroll in for free. Of course, they all pay their taxes, but that's not what I was getting at. So we have to, our goal, and that's always a little tricky to navigate, is back to the previous question, what if parents come in with crazy demands? So it's kind of tricky, but by and large, we're always striving to create a really strong, positive experience. We work really hard to have positive attitudes about school. For any teachers in the room, like, you know, that's difficult at this time of year when we're headed towards summer. It's hard sometimes to keep that a positive attitude. We try to do that, and we try to figure out what the best outcome is for each student in each circumstance. we try to communicate that to parents. So even if we have to make a phone call about a suspension or a discipline consequence of some lesser sort, we're still trying to frame that in terms of this is in the best interest of the student, that there be strong behavior expectations. We do ask parents, we really ask them that they support the school in enforcing high expectations for students. We don't ask parents to necessarily become content experts. That's part of what we're providing as a school. We have a faculty who have studied each of these subjects to a very high degree, but we do ask parents for their help in making kids do the homework. I think that's the biggest piece, that if kids actually do the reading and do the problems and do all the different pieces, that becomes very helpful. We also ask parents to support the school if we tell them that there was a behavior issue. If Johnny is drawing inappropriate things on his desk, Dad needs to stop that. Like the parents need to back the school when we come and say, hey, we have this problem. We also do a lot of focus on kind of external community outreach. We do tours at least twice a quarter, and we also do a decent amount of online advertising. We try to get into kind of the best school in Wake County, PR lists, our newspapers run, that sort of thing. But our biggest piece for bringing parents into what we're doing is really parental word of mouth. It's parents who say, hey, my kid has had a phenomenal experience at this school this year, and that mom tells her neighbor, y'all should come to Thales next year. And parents talk to each other. Now, there have certainly been years where that works against us. If we don't provide a positive experience, if we've got some weaker teachers and parents don't have a good experience with their kids in that class, the word of mouth is not helpful. But when we do our part and create a strong school experience that parents get what they want out of, they talk and they tell their friends. And we have sort of that raving fan experience where all of a sudden we've got more families coming in because this one family in this neighborhood had a really good experience with our school one year.
And I'd say for us, philosophically, again, my journey in this as a parent wanting better education options for my children really comes from a place of it is a partnership. My sense or my take in our organization as a whole is the idea that it is the right and responsibility of parents to direct the education upbringing of their children. We are here as partners in that. Even though we are doing that in partnership with parents, it's still your responsibility. So at the end of the day, we think we're a great option. We think we're really focused on the right things for children and a good partner, but it's still back on the parents at the end of the day. Just a quick reminder, again, if you guys have questions as we go, I invite you to just take a note card, send your question up, and we'll start taking some questions here shortly as well. What I'd like you guys to talk about is what does a student or graduate out of your program look like? What do you aspire? How do you aspire them to present themselves to society or as a citizen, either while they're in your program or at the end of what you guys do?
I'm thinking of a couple of students. We've had, I think we're now on this will be our 8th year of having a graduating class. We have over, I think, 200 graduates from our program at this point, or at least we will by this coming June. Our graduates are students who are, I think they're really prepared to do well wherever they're going. So far we have a 100% college placement rate at a 4-year school for all of our graduates who want to go on to a 4-year program. All of our students are well prepared with the basic habits of study. They know how to get their work done. They know how to work on their own. They know how to work in groups. I particularly aspire to our students also kind of speaking confidently and speaking well. That's one of the biggest pieces of our senior thesis process. We ask all students to spend a year writing a research paper and then condensing that into a speech that they have to defend in front of a faculty panel. That causes all of our students to develop the basic public speaking skills that position them well to go on into college. We also want our students to be able to work hard. They need to at least know what it means to work hard. Now again, a lot of that depends on them and their choices. We also want our students to know how to present themselves publicly in terms of eloquence and appearance and confidence. so that they're really prepared well to go into whatever field they want to go into. So then they should have the basics in terms of they've read a lot of literature, they have studied a lot of history, they hopefully know what it means to analyze something mathematically or scientifically. And then we expect them to draw on all of that in the next stage of life. So we really see that high school is not really the end of the journey, but it's really the culmination of the basics. So that they have the basics, they have the foundation, and they can then build from there.
We have many of the same goals for our students, those aspirations. We truly want our students to know truth, God's truth, to recognize beauty, and to pursue goodness. And that truth, beauty, and goodness are not relative, they're absolute. And to know what that means and to be pursuing that. We aspire for our students by the time they graduate to have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Some do and some don't. But those seeds have been planted, and it's really the Holy Spirit that's responsible for that more than we are. But we're at least planting those seeds, and we want them to be thoughtful, to think well, to think critically, to speak well, to be eloquent, and to reason well, to have the gift of rhetoric that I think in the past century that word has been held hostage. Rhetoric is typically spoken of in a pejorative way, but in the classical sense, rhetoric is a good man speaking well. So there is a moral component, a righteousness, and as well as to have a well-researched topic, and then to be able to present that, to communicate, articulate that in wonderful ways. And so that translates, the truth, beauty, and goodness, and the skills of rhetoric, that good man speaking well, and to live lives that are thoughtful, can translate into very great success at college and career. We want them to be prepared for the next step in their journey, whether that's college or something other than university, and certainly to be prepared for life. They have a career, but we have a longer vision. It's not what they look like at 18, it's what they look like at 85, and when they're prepared to meet their Maker, and what kind of life have they lived. We want to prepare them for the long haul, and we plant those seeds and pray that the Lord will use them.
So we've had over 500,000 students go through classical conversations, so I couldn't begin to describe any of them. They're all unique and different individuals. I could give you some of the school kind of answers, and we do take surveys of SAT scores, and we know what colleges they're getting into, we know what scholarships they're receiving, we know like military service, missionary, those kind of things. We do pay attention to what's going on, because people, like I said, when I opened up, investors, insurance people, bankers, they want to know, those kind of answers. And then all the things that you guys talked about, I would agree with too. So SAT scores and those kind of things are, measures that I could share with you. I would hope, though, that instead our students leave their families home curious and interested. And I would also hope that we change our perspective on how you measure the outcomes of our children. You would talk earlier about assessment, wanting more than that. What if classical education becomes so successful that all our high numbers plummet because we become the educational hospital to the world? Does that mean we're not succeeding? So I would say that just because our pioneers have done super well in the statistics and the results and the things that we've been talking about, I look forward to the day where we can say, you know what, they're not doing so well, but that's because everybody's doing it.
I appreciate that point, Leigh. I think I tell people that will it have succeeded as a movement of classical education, we can drop the word classical out of what we do, because it's back to what education is for everybody. So I appreciate that sentiment greatly. For us, I think our program is, we're providing an environment where we want to support our children to do hard things. We have high expectations. We want them to do hard things. We want them to learn lessons. We want them to fail. We want them to stumble. We want them to succeed. And we want them to do it within our environment so we can pick them up, help them learn a lesson, and ensure that they're able to take that and go forward and do great things with that in life. I like to say that we're providing education for our students that's elite without being elitist. We want to provide a high level of opportunity, but we want them to be humble and have a humility about their opportunity and who they've become by beginning to do those things. Our programs, we're intentionally not college prep. Typically, programs like a good classical school, you start thinking where your kid's going to school. We are, again, our kids, most of them go to college, but we also hold in equal regard our students who might want to go enlist in the military, who might want to go into the trades and get a job. So we recognize that college isn't the only pathway. It's a great pathway for some, but we have graduates who take a year off and go work on a fishing boat in Alaska and are wonderfully successful at it and have a good time. I think at the end of the day, we're about developing good citizens. We want our students, especially when they finish our program, to go out and be good mothers, good fathers, good neighbors, business leaders, elected officials, statesmen. And I think that's really what we're trying to do. We want our graduates to be capable of thinking about deep things. We want them to explore ideas and be able to have conversations. And we want them to know real things. And it's unfortunate I say we want graduates to know things because public education is not about knowing things anymore to a large extent. And again, I think it just at the end, like Sam said, they're also 18. They're not fully formed. The frontal lobe is not all there yet. They still have another 5 to 10 years to go before they're fully formed. So we want to put them on the right path, and we want to help them order their affections to want to pursue the good, true, and beautiful. So with that, I want to get your takes on question in the back.
Sorry, I thought you were going to turn it over to questions, so I can go ahead. I do have a question, but I can wait till you're done.
Yeah, if you want to write it and send it up,
Well, I have a series of questions. I don't know how that's going to work.
we'll give us another 1 or 2 rounds and we'll do questions with that. So, great. What do you guys see as the future of classical education moving forward from where we are today?
I think we're going to see a continuation of what's been happening in the last few years where we've reached some sort of, I don't know if we're at a critical mass stage, but there now are multiple networks. I would list the Hillsdale network is significant, the Great Hearts network is significant. I think Thales has the potential to be equally significant as far as operating on kind of a nationwide scale. I think all 3 of those are working in slightly different ways towards the same goal of functionally replacing the broken public education system. There certainly are excellent public school teachers still in that system, but nationwide as a whole, that system is kind of broken from the inside. And those 3 different groups with no external coordination, I know of at least, are all trying to sort of position themselves to the point where they could provide a brick and mortar replacement for public education kind of on a national scale. At the same time, you've already got a growing system of sort of support institutions around that. The Classic Learning Test is trying to take out the monopoly that the College Board has. Groups like the Institute for Excellence in Writing are providing strong curricular resources for that particular area. Classical Academic Press is doing some great work, Memoria Press. There's different groups that are now trying to provide the curriculum that would help with that. My turn for a shameless plug. Thales Press is also trying to do something similar with providing high quality, very affordable resources. I brought 9 samples with me. The first 9 people who come up to me after this and want any of these, you are welcome to them. I think what we're going to see are a lot of different models where different groups with different levels of entrepreneurship, different levels of support, different ideas, are all trying to create something new. And the question is it going to be good? And I think that's really the time will tell. But I think that's where the metaphor of the laboratories of democracy comes to my mind, where maybe Hillsdale's got a great piece that works in certain areas. The Lee's may work great in certain areas. Great Hearts might work in certain areas. There's going to be a lot of different groups trying a lot of things, but I think this is really, I just think it's getting bigger.
If you look at some of the recent statistical growth and diminishment of different types of schools, between 2003 and 2017, if you compare various types of Christian schools versus the classical Christian school movement, and this is looking at bricks and mortar schools, looking at Seventh-day Adventists, Catholics, Association of Christian Schools International, Christian Schools International, all of these lost between 7% and 27% in terms of the number of schools and the number of students educated between 2003 and 2017. The two large umbrella organizations of classical Christian schools, the Association of Classical Christian Schools and the Society for Classical Learning, both had dramatic growth. Society for Classical Learning grew 135%, and Association of Classical Christian Schools grew 108%. So that was pre-COVID, from 03 to 17. Other studies from 2019 to 2021, the COVID period, public education lost 18% enrollment. Charter schools, I think the classical charter schools are the exception, but just the general charter school movement lost 3%. But the classical Christian schools continued to rise. And the micro schools, many of whom are classical Christian, these are the hybrid kind of university model is one description, where they're partially homeschool, partially traditional school. That grew between 2019 and 21, grew 50%. The homeschool enrollment grew 100% in those 2 years. And so the classical charter schools, the classical homeschoolers, the classical bricks and mortar Christian schools, and then those hybrid schools are all growing. And I think that trajectory is going to continue. That people, I think with COVID, the curtain was open, and people saw what was going on a little bit more clearly in the public schools. And just both from a instructional standpoint, philosophical standpoint, as well as just social demise. And I see that trend continuing, that people want a different type of education. And I think the next 10 years is just going to continue to mushroom.
Yeah, I agree with that. So something that's been on my mind and doing a lot of research on is a lot of you might know that in 2025, the college cliff is coming, because it's the year that the first freshman born in 2007, when the United States birth rate lowered beyond replacement. And so we don't have enough children. And of course, geopolitically, that's causing problems everywhere. So children are disappearing. They're not going to be around. And we need, the few that are there, we need to really equip them well in order to make up for the lack of the only resource that is eternal human beings. So this is very exciting for me to be on this panel, because even though, like, if I was selling Ford and you were Jeep and Toyota and whatever, we would disagree and we would say, buy my product. But we would not exist without each other. So I'm also glad for all the opportunities that COVID, oh happy monster, made available to us. And so just keeping that in mind with the number of students that are going to, the number plummeting, this has also given us an opportunity for small to kind of start over again. And so I'd like to share what we do at our church. I have a pastor who's as convicted as I am that schools should never be publicly funded. They should be all privately done. And of course, as a church, we believe in Christian education. So my small church of about 250 people, half of which are under 18, does 4 things. We sponsor a 5-day-a-week ACCS school that's down the street. We host a 3-day-a-week covenant prep, what you refer to as a hybrid school, and 1 day a week classical conversations meets at our church. Our facility's too small to have a full-time school there that would have your expectations. On top of that, we also have a scholarship fund in case those 4 options aren't appealing to you. So the 120 plus children in our church, not a one of them goes to public school. Every one of them is getting Christian education 7 days a week because our church also does a lot of other things together too. So I only see great hope, and I'm really glad that classical education is going to do like everything else under the sun does. It will come and it will go. Israel will rise, it will fall. But there will always be those monks in the back room preserving the remnant of information that the Lord would have preserved. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of you in this room are going to be part of that, so that whatever horrific thing happens next, we'll be okay on the other side.
Last round before we open up to questions. I appreciate you remaining standing in the back. We'll get to you in a sec. Challenges that you see with classical education growing. What are those? What have those been for you guys? And I'll say, just for us, as we're undergoing just a lot of expansion, a lot of new families wanting what we're offering. Frankly, it's besides facilities, which is a numbers and cost thing, good teachers and people willing and ready to come teach in a classical school is hard to come by. Finding people who are classically educated, ready to come into education is, there are great opportunities right now. I know there are a number of programs across the country launching to help people be able to help instruct, to form them, to prepare them to teach in a classical school. I've been surprised going out and talking about classical education and having teachers in normal public schools these days, because again, there are great teachers out there. I hope everybody in public education is in it with the right heart, but there are plenty of teachers who've never heard of classical education, who when they hear about what we're doing, they want to be part of it. They don't know that there's an option, they're excited about it. I've had meetings where I've had people teaching in normal public schools crying about what they're being required to teach children, and excited about the opportunity to be in schools like ours. So I would like to do that as a plug for anybody attending a program here at Belmont Abbey. Please consider supporting and considering a career in a classical school. And I think also the last one, again, I've had great respect for people up here on this panel, just the severe lack of classical school leaders. I mean, that's really something that we need as a movement to figure out, is how do we develop people who understand the philosophy of classical education, who have experience as educators, and then bring them into the movement. I know that's such a hard thing, because you also have to have a heart to love kids and want to be a part of that too. So I'd like to kind of get y'all's perspective. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that you're facing? And then we'll take some questions.
Great question. I think for us, the first one that comes to my mind is the difficulty of doing moral education in the absence of a Christian metaphysic. But I've spent a lot of time this year thinking about some of the national conservatism, Christian nationalism kind of things. And one of the biggest pieces I've concluded out of that, I think Aaron Wren has this great analysis of a second or third, a neutral world versus a negative world. If he's right, my school, particularly as a secular classical school, it's a neutral world project that assumes that we can assert basic Christian morality in a world that is at least neutral towards Christian presuppositions. It's increasingly hard to do that. I think it's still possible to do that, but it's harder than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I did not have students who were sort of reflexively Nietzschean nihilist. And today I have lots of those students. Relativism was there 5 years ago, but it's the norm today. And there's an increasing amount of offense if you tell students they're wrong. And education is really hard to do if students will not accept the fact that they're wrong, learn from it, and fix whatever they were doing. So that's the first one I mentioned. Secondly, certainly for us, we have a huge demand to expand. Land is expensive, and building supplies are expensive right now. So we need the economy to get back to a better state and interest rates to drop. So if that happens, families can continue to expand. But until then, we're probably not able to do a lot more than we currently have. I'll just echo everything Derek just said about personnel. Great teachers have always been hard to find, but great classically oriented, liberally trained teachers, those are rare. And they know their value, and they're usually interested in schools that have a really clear vision. So and they also usually have a destination they would like to be in, and maybe it's North Carolina, maybe it's Texas. Like it's always tricky to figure out how exactly to solve the personnel issue. So I think that's the more programs we have that are kind of building people in those ways, the greater supply of excellent teachers we'll have to support the movement.
I think we have many of the same challenges. The teacher, getting highly qualified teachers that really understand and are willing to learn and grow as classical Christian educators is certainly a challenge, especially many of our schools. The Society for Classical Learning has 691 member schools. 30 of those are classical charter schools. 27 of those are international schools. The rest are Christian classical schools in the U.S. The average enrollment, K through 12 enrollment of those schools is something like 160 students. Now there are a couple that are 1,200, 1,000 students, and a couple that are 800 students, but both the mean and median size is about 160, 165 students. What that means is the compensation is typically not great. And so to be able to attract and retain teachers at what many of the schools are able to pay, that's a challenge. Secondly, while what goes on in the classroom is the most important thing, you do need capable leaders, both at the board level and then heads of schools and division heads. And so to train up those leaders is vital. It's just imperative that occur. And there are, in the last few years, a big shift in terms of providing training for school leaders, both board members and school staff leaders. But that's necessary for this movement to continue.
So our challenge is really different because as long as there's parents and a tree to meet under, we're okay with facilities. Right? The biggest battles we've had over the last 40 years has been legal and lobbying fees for poor policymakers. Ronald Reagan said the 9 most feared words in the English language are "we're the government and we're here to help," and that has only proved to be true for classical conversations. So let me give you a little bit of background, because right now our biggest enemy is the governor of Arkansas and Arizona and these new school choice laws. And I know a lot of people in this room are probably for them, and that's okay. We're here because we can disagree with one another. So, think about the history of what we've had to go through as homeschoolers. So first, in the 80s, we had to deal with being fined for homeschooling. Parents were put in jail, our children were taken away from us. So we had to fight that bureaucratic administration. Then we got left alone for a while, and our children started getting old enough to go on to colleges. Well, then we had to fight the admissions departments to say, yeah, just because we don't have a transcript that's from the state, Christian school, why would you not trust the parent to know what in the world their children did for the last 18 years? Well, we changed that. So in 1997, when I started Classical Conversations, not a single school in the United States would take Latin as a high school credit to move on to college. Now, all of them do, except for the Air Force Academy, and I know they don't mean it because they take our students all the time. And the reason that happened was because we were teaching our kids Latin, and they didn't want that. It wasn't a living language. Well, we were in a modern progressive era, so that's why it had to be a living language, not a classical language. Now all of them will accept our children, and that's great because when you get, I don't know how many of the students you guys have had go through your program with Latin, and you guys and us and SEL and all the other ones that you were so kind to mention. But when you got millions of children studying Latin, is it a dead language anymore? So we've had to fight the college admission process. Then more recently, about 5 years before COVID, the local county councils and county commissioners started to attack churches that were doing anything with for-profits. Classical Conversations is a for-profit, just like church janitors and florists and funeral homeowners. Churches are totally able to work with for-profits. Well, some local folks decided that no, if they were going to have your tax write-off as a church, then you couldn't work with any for-profits, and so they went after us. So a church in Oregon was fined $70,000 because Classical Conversations met in their Sunday school classrooms. So we paid the bill because we would never ask a church to do something that was our fault. And the pastor stepped up and he said, let me help you with this. And he wrote a scathing letter to his county commissioner saying, why do you think the state has any right to define what Christian education is and how we go about doing it? Somebody with some sense read that letter and we got our money back. And now we have an amazing letter because hundreds of counties started suing, not suing, but fining churches that we were working with. So now we have a letter and they get to read that and they don't proceed any further. During the Obama years, we were investigated along with anybody else that's part of the gig economy. You all know what that means, because what is a homeschooling mom who's tutoring? She's a gig economist. And so we were investigated by the state of Florida and the state of Missouri for hiring practices. And then, of course, in California, things got really dicey. Well, fortunately, both those states, when they were doing the audit on my company, dropped it. Now, I wish they hadn't. I wish they'd gone farther and written a letter and said that we were okay, but they dropped it before they even got to that point. Because we're trying as hard as we can to be good citizens of this country, even though we're just visitors here and we're citizens of heaven. So we won that. But meanwhile, in California, we lost. Everybody lost in California. And so Classical Conversations in California is run differently than it is in the other 49 states. But there are some liberal states that are following in California's footsteps. So we pay a lot of money in legal and lobbying fees in the states to try to keep homeschooling, not just homeschooling free, the whole gig economy free. If your wife wants to teach piano lessons, she should be allowed to, right? It should not be illegal. That's what's happened out in California. So besides fighting that, while we were fighting that, I should say, some of the legislators in more conservative states saw what was happening, and we paid lobbyists and we worked with lawyers in the state of Oklahoma, and they actually passed a bill that explicitly said that for-profits are not a cause of harming nonprofits, their association with one another. Because see, I can take on the feds, there's just one of them. I can take on 50 states. But how do I take on 3,000 counties? Because that's how many I'm in. And county commissioners come and go, don't they? So we've spent a lot of money learning how to work with folks who think they're here to help us, and they aren't. Now, so besides that, now we've got these school choice rules, or laws that are being passed. So in Arizona, because they've had vouchers forever, they've had ESAs for a number of years, when it was only $1,000 a student, that didn't affect Classical Conversations because no parent's going to sell their child's soul for $1,000. One of the things we have in Classical Conversations is you have to be a Christian, committed homeschooler to be a leader, a director, a part of our staff, one of the ones that goes out to help people, because you can't lead people in things that you yourself won't do. So we've been doing fine in Arizona, but now that they're offering $7,000 per child, that is a high amount of money for a parent with 4, 5, 6 kids to give up. So we are losing communities because we can't find directors who meet our qualifications of being privately funded Christians in their homeschools. You see what's going on? We could take them. Do you also see the opposite of that? What if I said, wonderful, $7,000 a child? Let's go. I would be a billionaire overnight because we have so many children in so many states where this kind of money is being distributed. Instead, I'd rather hurt myself financially, like we've done all these years when fighting these laws and these legal fees, because my commitment isn't to money. The Lord will provide all that I need. I will have all my resources will be provided by Him. But I can't be lying to parents and saying, oh, it's okay to fight Marxism with more Marxism. That doesn't make any sense. Let's not have private schools now become public schools and say that's more choice. Now they're all just public schools. The private schools will go away if they start taking the money from the public schools. So I'm a freedom maximalist. I have been since I was 12 years old. And I'm constantly alert for the things that are going on in this realm. And did you all just see last week the yeshiva schools in New York City are now under attack? About 100 years ago, they said, look, we don't want our kids in your public school systems. You don't teach our philosophy. And the state of New York said, that's fine. We'll give you public funding and we won't interfere with your schools. The same thing that's being said in Arizona and Arkansas and the other states with these laws. Last week, yeshiva schools were told, you will be closed down, you will stop receiving public funding if you don't start teaching the state curriculum. It took 100 years. But it should have started in the first place. They should have known they can't serve two masters. And so we'll continue the battle, and we'll win, because I know who's in charge.
With that, we're out of time. So do you guys want to take one question? You've been patient standing in the back.
Oh, well, I understand because I'm sitting all day, right?
All right.
Therapeutic, right? No, I'll get with you guys at meals and hospitality.
Great, sounds good. So, well, I'd like to thank you guys for coming. It's been a pleasure just getting to talk to you about classical education. We'll be up here. If you have any questions, we'd love to take them. And have a great afternoon. Thanks for being here.